Greetings and welcome back to room 303. These are our summative comments on Gibran's The Prophet. We find ourselves now at lecture number 30, final observations. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side is our playlist for the preceding 29 lectures. The genesis of this project I've referenced earlier, and now I will bring it to its conclusion. In December of 2023, Worland High School, and more particularly the junior class of Worland High School, lost one of our own. And in that process, there was tremendous anxiety, suffering, and pain. I found myself in that same December of 2023 later in the wonderful city of Vienna, sitting in one of my favorite churches there, Rupertskirche, the oldest church in Vienna. If you're ever there, I certainly recommend it to you. And I was sitting in a Taizé service, and I was considering, praying, thinking about the loss of our student and the anguish of my students, and especially the group of students that I lectured to 6th hour, that honors group of honors junior students, of which the young man was such an integral and close part. And I was asking what it was that I could do to maybe try to address the pain, the suffering I was feeling, my colleagues were feeling, and obviously my students were feeling. I walked out of that experience and walked across the courtyard area there to my favorite bookstore in Vienna, the Shakespeare bookstore. And I walked in and was just rambling about and came to the very first volume that I saw, and it was Gibran's Prophet. And it was in that moment that I decided, I think that I will address the pain and suffering that I and others are feeling through a series of talks on Gibran's Prophet, and that is the genesis. That's what led to this series of 30 conversations about these magnificent poems. The Prophet is a text that has been an integral part of my life for many, many years, and especially my teaching life, no question. I think when we addressed the chapter on teaching, I said as much. So now we come to the end, and how do you even finish a set of 29, now 30 lectures on Gibran's Prophet? Like, what can be said? Well, let's review just one last time, guys, where we've been. The first thing that we would remind ourselves, and I think all of this is germane to our study of the Prophet, and my goal, my hope, is that you will pick this volume up and read it. I mean, there are some of us that will read this at least once a year. We'll just pick up the volume and read through it in order or jumping around. It's such a useful text either way. You'll remember that we started with an observation or two. The new is the new, the N-E-W. That which we are so certain has never been said before is actually the new, K-N-E-W. There's nothing new under the sun, the Ecclesiastes writer in the Old Testament of the Christian and Hebrew Bible will say. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think what Gibran does in The Prophet is reminds us that these questions about losing people, about loving people, about what it means to work, these questions are really old questions. And in that regards, we rediscover every time we pick up Gibran's Prophet and we read it. We also said at the very beginning how important it is that we recognize that we are the stories that we tell. We are the stories that we retell. Of course, we're the stories that we decide to either accept or to reject. And obviously, we have all four of those dynamic understandings of story here. Of course, I use the word story. I mean, obviously, these are poems. But in terms of story, the idea that we are always moving in some kind of progressive position, always evolving, always, he calls it traveling, and I love that word picture as well. And that leads us, of course, to ask about these stories, about these poems. What are your favorites? And a number of you have asked, well, what is your favorite? And my normal response to that is, of course, the same response that I'm asked about my favorite child or my favorite grandchild or my favorite student, and I'll usually say the one I'm with at the time, and I'll usually say that as well about these set of poems. Which is your favorite? And I'll usually say, well, the one I'm reading at the time. But I will answer that question at the conclusion of this lecture. We also began by making observations that we define learning in 303 as that longing, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. You'll notice that we were constantly making references later in the poems to earlier poems, and I think that's a wonderful way to read the prophet. I think that we also want to remind ourselves that one of those prisms through which we study these poems was what we call the Big Five. That is to say, what do these poems, each of them, say about epistemology, what you can know, ontology, who you are, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, the study of the collective or group mind, and then finally, the question of theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering, which, as I said, was in many ways the genesis of this very lecture series itself. Let's go through them really quickly to ask, what did you learn about each of these? We'll begin with epistemology and what you can know. Notice that Gibran, speaking through Al-Mustafa, the prophet, the poet, will say about knowing things that it's often unclear, and that we must be very careful to not hold too regularly that absolutist epistemological position. I am right and you are wrong, and if you don't agree with me, then I have nothing to do with you. The spirit, the tone, the voice of these poems are rather more what we have called fallibilist. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. And you'll notice that even in the farewell, that Al-Mustafa will in fact gesture at the potentiality that there's a whole lot that he could have missed and probably did miss. I think that this epistemological position of fallibilism, what, of course, after the scientific enlightenment and the differentiation of the value spheres, as we've referred to it in other lectures at learnstrong.net, is really about basic science. In other words, about any position that's held in science. We'll say, I think I'm right, but we could be wrong about this. We got to collect more data. We have to do more observations. And I think epistemologically, the fallibilist position makes a lot of sense here as well. About any position that you hold, that you are 100% absolutely certain of, be careful, Gibran seems to suggest. Be careful. Be open to the opinions of others and be willing to hear what they have to say. Now, we will say this. It's one thing to know things, it's another thing to practice them, or as some spiritual teachers have called it, the map is not the territory. In other words, you can read these poems, it's the living out of this information that's always going to be the biggest challenge, no doubt. Ontologically, the question of who are you, and by extension then, who are we? Well, I think that Gibran would argue, we are a body, and we are a mind. I mean, you have to have a mind to argue there is no mind, no doubt. But then he makes this argument, there's something that seems to be even transcendent to that. He'll call it spirit, God's spirit sometimes. And I think that challenge then, ontologically speaking, of these poems, and you guys can kind of make up your own mind about how you read these poems, but I think one of the arguments is, why does he keep using musical references? Because I think he understands the value of harmony, the value of balance. Ontologically, you are a body, no doubt, and you are a mind, no doubt, and you are a spirit. Can you balance those in some useful way? And to do so, I think Gibran would argue is harmony, and I think he would argue that harmony is always honesty. The fundamental root of honesty is, in fact, harmony. To be harmonious in yourself, and then, of course, within the larger community, which leads us, of course, to psychology and sociology. In terms of the individual mind, psychology, the obvious concern is always going to be what? Well, there's going to be shame of past actions and fear of future possible actions or endeavors. And we live within this kind of half-light where we're always worrying about things that we either did or didn't do in the past, and then we're always worrying about things that are going to come. Of course, I think it's Gibran that's pointing out to us again and again, the past is an illusion. It's over and it's done. You can't go back to it in any meaningful way. And, of course, the future is something we never actually arrive at. The moment that you arrive at your own parting, your own getting on the ship, to use the metaphor of death, that will happen in the only thing we actually have, the present. And I think that's one of the central teachings of this collection of poems is, as much as possible, try to be present, mindful, as you look at your own life and as you look at others, which obviously leads us to the sociological position. You'll remember Plato said, be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting their own battle. And I think that's a profound insight, certainly very much a Gibran insight. The idea is this for Gibran. Yes, you have to take care of your life, but you recognize that your life is intertwined with everyone else's life. The old, silly middle school mentality, leave me alone, I lead my own life. Well, here's the problem. You say that in a language you didn't choose to learn. It was given to you. And from the moment of conception on, it was never in some profound way your life. It's always been our life. We're all in this thing together. And because we're in this together, there isn't any way to extricate ourselves from that recognition. We are connected. And I think Gibran would want us sociologically to be reminded of that. Of course, his word is community. And I think that's a profoundly important insight that we too often overlook. Of course, the last of the big five is the question of theodicy. Why? Why must there be pain? Why must there be loss? Why must there be suffering? Why, of course, must this happen at all? And again, I think that Gibran's argument is that pain and suffering, while unwelcome, is still apropedeutic. It's didactic, it's instructional. There is something that can be learned from even the worst imaginable pain, and we obviously have endured some of the worst imaginable pain. In other words, when terrible things happen, stop asking, why did this happen to me or to us? It is an unanswerable question to begin with. And second, it posits us as somehow victims in a universe where all of this stuff is happening and there's very little that we can do about it. I think Gibran's argument is to change the 2 to the 4 and say, why did this happen for me? Why did this happen for us? Not that we're celebrating it. Yippee, bad things are... No, not at all. But rather, a certain perspective of grace that says, when terrible things happen, and happen they will. No question. When terrible things happen, can we ask at least, what are we to learn through this experience? And I'm hopeful that our study of the prophet has led you to challenge yourself in the communities that you're a part of. What can we learn from the pain and the suffering that is always going to be a part? Yes, no question, joy as well. But as he said repeatedly, you've got to go through a lot of pain to get to the joy. Finally, I think there are some takeaways. Let's just finish with these observations. I think there's 3 major takeaways that I would at least like to share with you. Obviously, there's many more. I think the first of those is that life is learning. I think it's a huge challenge for us to recognize that you guys are young, soon you won't be. And I think there's this recognition that your whole life, that experience of swinging at the park until you have to go to the van, which no child ever wants to go to the van, right? We always want to stay at the park swinging. The experience of swinging is the experience of learning. Always learning. Of course, Tennyson will say it maybe the best in his poem Ulysses, which Gibran loved, to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bounds of human thought. That is the goal. And I think life is learning. But not only is life learning, but life is also loving. And I think that's one of those central understandings. If you had to push me to answer what is my favorite single line of all of the lines in this majestic collection of poems, it would be that work is love made visible. And I love the idea that work can be understood as anything one does, especially if one is doing it with some sense of intentionality. That is to say, life is always about loving. And I think we can easily forget that. And then it is the, I think, simple voice that's oftentimes so brilliantly relayed through the poems of the prophet. It's a simple observation, but it's so important that our life is about love. And for Gibran, of course, he takes very seriously that religious spiritual insight that God is love. You can't think of anything higher than love, and therefore the penultimate, if you want to call it God or deity or whatever you want to call it, that is to say, it's always going to come back to love. The recognition, as of course, the Hindu texts will teach it to us, the recognition to recognize all being in oneself and oneself in all being. That capacity is, I think, for Gibran, his fundamental understanding of love. And without that, well, there isn't anything worth living for. That's the biggest challenge. And then finally, I think he would make the argument that life is not only learning and loving, but it's got to be growing. there's got to be this sense that there's always something else waiting. There is the next voyage. There is the next journey. And even though Al-Mustafa is not really excited maybe to get on the boat and leave the people, he is excited for the next journey. And I think that we always have to hold on to. Because why? Life is a letting go. It's a learning to live within a present moment, but recognizing that the breath you're breathing right now had a beginning, but it also must have an ending. And that, of course, is going to make us on some level sad. Why can't we have that breath that we just had? And yet, there's another breath, there's another experience. And that moving forward, that growing, is, I think, foundational to our reading as well. I love to ask people, and this has happened now recently because I'm giving these lectures, I'm talking about Gibran's prophet, oh, I love that, and I always ask, why? And it's interesting the ways that people will respond to that. I don't know. I mean, it just kind of speaks to me. It says things to me that I guess are said in words that I never really thought about before in the same way, and I love that as well. To finish, though, if I had to pick the passage that I think speaks as well to that 6th-hour group that I've dedicated this series of lectures to, it would be to go back very early in the book, in the collection of poems, to his views on love. And he says it this way, and these will be my final parting reading words to you guys. When you love, you should not say, God is in my heart, but rather, I'm in the heart of God. And think not you can direct the course of love. For love, if it finds you worthy, directs your course. Love has no other desire but to fulfill itself. And if you love and must needs have desires, let these be your desires. To melt and be like a running brook that sings its melody to the night. To know the pain of too much tenderness. To be wounded by your own understanding of love. And to bleed willingly and joyfully, to wake at dawn with a winged heart and give thanks for another day of loving, to rest at the noon hour and meditate love's ecstasy, to return home at eventide with gratitude, and then to sleep with a prayer for the beloved in your heart and a song of praise upon your lips. It seems to me there is no higher calling. I'm grateful that you have taken this journey with me. Now, keep traveling. Thank you.